Hello to the first session of Worldmakings and Worldendings, an alternative geology of the world. Numerous universes might have been botched and bungled through an eternity ere this system was struck out, much labor lost, many fruitless trials made, and a slow but continual improvement carried out during infinite ages in the art of world-making. David Hume, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Building upon ANON's Altwoke Manifesto, as well as their previous seminar, Collapse Reconfiguration, this seminar will explore the conflation of the world as the map with the Earth as its territory by focusing on how similarities and differences between geology and geography have contributed to such conflation. Geology, as it is typically defined, is the science of dynamic processes and the physical history of the Earth. A contemporary use of the Greek word eidos is in the phrase eidetic memory, which is the clinic term for photographic memory. The original Greek root eidos was used by Aristotle in his articulation of metaphysics. Eidos denoted the form of a thing as distinct from the matter of the thing. Another sense in which we can understand this dichotomy is in Spinoza's metaphysical division between extension and thought. In the first module of this seminar, participants will expand the notion of geology to explore how material, social, and economic processes converge into the world, an auxiliary ecosystem of matter and paradigms within the Earth. Using Deleuze and Guattari's method of nomadic thought, this seminar will move across disciplines such as epigenetics, multidimensional psychology, linguistics, and mysticism to trace the processes which provide the structural components of the world over time, symmetrically to the Earth development. The world's genesis begins with the universe's intelligibility as a cognitive map of human subjects. Turning world-making inside out requires us to think rigorously around the notion of narrative in relation of the impact of our cognitive behavioral assumptions and their implications. Using this as a starting point, in the second module, we'll employ a transdisciplinary approach to the history of rituals to understand how superstition operates in politics and economy, and the way in which semantic content and material extensions complement one another. The second module also explores the political implications of apocalypse in both its paradigmatic and common biblical dimensions. Participants will learn about cataclysms and how it can be bootstrapped for the cultivations of new growth. Alexandra Mason is a member of ANON, a techno-futurist, left accelerationist collective. She attended the New School for undergrad and is currently in the process of completing her MA at the Murphy Institute for Worker Education and Labor Study at CUNY, where she anticipates completing her thesis on the ever-present role technological platforms and data play within society, and possible ways in which future movements can unlock their emancipatory potential. Presently, she is working on several essays with other members of ANON and independent work for future talks, pairing pop culture analysis with theory, exploring other topics of interest such as biopolitics, the relationship between history and temporality, power and surveillance. I give you Alexandra.
Okay, hello everyone. So I wanted to take this class to do introductions and have everybody introduce themselves, and also talk about a little bit of housekeeping regarding the next class. But I will wait and push that off until there's a few more people here. So to just dive right in, I wanted to first talk this session about how the class is structured and the content that we decided to fill it with, because that in and of itself illuminates some of our ideas. As it stands now, we don't think that there's a single discipline that on its own can provide enough knowledge to weather the storm of the next few decades or years even, though comprehensively understanding one may offer a few clues. When I was trying to create notes for this session, one of the things that kept popping into my mind was pursuing the internet as a teenager and looking at a bunch of articles that used to be on Psychology Today that talked about what some were hypothesizing would happen with the internet and how that would affect and reorganize the ways in which people, especially younger generations, think. So particularly people used to think that it would have a bit of a Wikipedia-ing effect on us. And what I mean by that is that it was thought that we would move from thinking about things deeply and linearly in terms of disciplines to having more of a cursory knowledge of a vast amount of disciplines. So like more of a horizontalizing effect. If we think about it right now, presently in schools and institutions that we have, we're still currently taught in terms of pockets that make up said disciplines, and these are taught as isolated courses. So that means, you know, at 8 a.m. you go to history, then you move to math, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty much what we're trying to do is instead have one single class, and that's this, that spans multiple different areas. And even though we must have some localization, so you'll see that each class is dedicated to a specific topic, the idea is that we're supposed to inspire you to traverse various lines of thought. So for instance, we have a class that's coming up on biology and genetics, and in it, we're also going to bring up biopolitics, which we're going to sort of delve a little bit into today, given one of the readings that I threw in there. But talking about all of this automatically lies at the intersection of history and philosophy and political philosophy. And you'll find that we'll have to talk about all these things in order to map out the entire course. So for instance, again, on the class on psychology and psychotherapy, we're essentially going to track the movement over time from the DSM to what's called the RDOC, and we're going to talk more about that when we get there. But pretty much the RDC is a multidimensional model and way of looking at how the human mind responds to stimuli, as opposed to the DSM. If you've ever looked at it, it has different abnormalities or mental illnesses put there as pockets, and then when you are in front of the client or in front of you, they're supposed to talk to you, and you write that down as isolated things that add up to whether or not you give them whatever definition or whatever illness based on what they're saying. So although this multidimensional model and this move to that isn't being used across the board yet, and we still use the DSM, what I'm trying to bring up is a general tendency that's going to be brought up a couple times within this class, which is that we're moving towards more of a broad reshuffling and reorganization when it comes to former ways or models of thinking. So if I were to try to draw or map out the structure of the class and lectures, I would have to depict pieces of information as points, and you'll see me talk about concepts or information, and then like later loop back around to those points again. But sometimes when I loop back to them, I then change direction and go to another completely different direction when I'm talking about things. So with that said, I also want to look within this class and explore the ways in which disciplines converse with one another, and in what ways they sometimes talk past each other, because sometimes this happens. Again, this is sort of a very rudimentary attempt at trying to make and create a uniform set of sessions that make up the class that will draw different connections between disciplines than what you might encounter within a formal institution. In terms of like pedagogical format, what we're going to do will depend on the class. But for instance, like today, we're going to do a bit of a lecture and then a more seminar-based discussion. And I may have you guys sometimes present in pairs, or I may have some of you teach something briefly to the class, especially if you seem like you have particular knowledge of a subject. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we, as members of ANON, and the ideas of Altwoke personally got to where we are now over time. I'm assuming that's maybe why some of y'all were interested in taking the class. So since there's been some time between what people typically know us for, the companion and the manifesto, and we've written a couple things in between then, I wanted to track how we've come to all of these developments. So we went from the manifesto, which was pretty much taking shots at everybody in it. We talked about the moderate left, the farther left, and then the companion is more so trying to deal with arguments that are brought up by the right. This is somewhat central to us, like focusing on the political right as a whole, only in so much as they are really fascinating and we're often like in awe of how it operates. When we're trying to put together these pieces, we were really, in a weird way, fascinated by the ways in which the alt-right sort of automatically coalesced together to create this movement that traversed time and space, pretty much. So we talked about land, neo-reactionary theory in particular, the alt-right, and this was in part because of where we were in time. And this was right after Trump's election, and people were really scared, and people wanted to know what the right was all about. We wanted to show and had to learn about the basic players within it, and then went to teach other people about it. In terms of trying to tackle the arguments of the right, and in doing this, and trying to get through this process, it became clear that we needed to map out what the right even is and what they believe. And here we're talking about nodes that make up the constellation that we can refer to broadly as the far right. In doing that, it became clear that we needed to traverse a large network of knowledge, especially to both talk about the broader right, as well as similarities or overlaps between different subgroups and where they differ. So we constantly had to refer to historical events, but also touch on things from economics to biology. And it then became apparent that to explain where they fall short arguments-wise, and by that I mean the right, in terms of content, and sometimes where they're just plain misinformed or being disingenuous, it became necessary to give an overview of what experts in that field actually think. So for example, some on the far right go and delve into what's called human biodiversity a lot. In order to even explain that, we had to, or disprove it, we had to talk about genetics broadly, populations, and how genetic information was passed on. So in doing that, the more we explain these things to others, the more a feedback loop began to form between what we were writing and the material we were putting in talks and things like that, and what we were beginning to realize as we spoke to these other people. And what we were starting to see was that the levels that we needed to delve into to discuss this vast amount of knowledge kept deepening, and we had to keep reaching back further and further and look at the broader picture. This showed to us that we needed, and this means like everybody in general, a more robust understanding of what the world is as it is. And we need to understand this to, in a sense, overturn it, to challenge fundamental ideas of perception. Because if you're talking to someone that is neo-reactionary or even white nationalist or something, you're dealing with someone who has deeply rooted ideas. And when these ideas exist in the mind of the individual, what happens is it functions much like a circuit or a feedback loop, where new sensory input is fit back into a structured narrative. So even in bringing up how we were touching on these ideas, you see that I'm starting to get at something deeper here because I just used the word circuit. And this brings us to a broader discussion about perception and seeing. We can tackle how we would like to talk about this from many different angles. So for instance, from the standpoint of media and marketing, advertising's fundamental premise relies on sort of a hijacking of the way in which humans perceive the world. We're typically prone to taking shortcuts in terms of cognitive thinking and organizing in terms of representative symbols and And organizing in terms of representative symbols is one way that we do this. So something like marketing hijacks and takes advantage of this. And especially if we look at marketing that is used for companies that operate within the capitalist mode of production. Companies that operate within this economic structure are used to make the reach of a business potentially global. So for instance, if we see McDonald's arches, it's not just something that's easy for us to understand and stick in our heads, but this effect is totalizing and cut across varying languages and across geographic space in order to reach people throughout the world. So you can be in any country and just show the symbol and everybody sort of understands what that is. Well, we could also talk about perception in terms of psychology. So for instance, with what is thought of as a Rorschach test, although there's some serious debate over their use and how they should be used and their accuracy. We could also talk about it in terms of science. So for instance, those pictures where you see two things at once, you see like a vase, but you also see two women, things like that. But we can also, and we will, delve into it in terms of political philosophy. So when a lot of thinkers, particularly the Frankfurt School, were talking about and mapping out what fascism is and what that means, people would point to how it is the embodiment of an ideology that is both the aestheticization of politics and the politics of aestheticization. So we can also talk about it in terms of philosophy, which brings me to some of the other broader points that I wanted to bring up today. So this gets us not just into perception, but relations. So for instance, perception implies me seeing when I say the word perception, but it also, there is an understanding that I am being seen by others. And that would be, broadly speaking, Hegel and what he was getting at. For Kant, it's the idea that we're looking at how subjects see objects and how that perception is limited and what is the nature of that perception. And then we can go over to Heidegger and think about how there's a world of objects and how that relates to subjects. All of this, broadly speaking, has to do with angles of understanding perception. Seeing then becomes super important. And this is something that we're going to, again, delve into multiple times throughout the class. That's why it's sort of structured the way it is, why we're going to look at both things like genetics and also psychology, because we have to see how all these disciplines think about how we see. And after thinking about all of that, it became more important to think about, or very important to think about, how language functions or how we communicate that perception to others. So in a way, this brings us back to a discussion on the nature of disciplines as they're studied. And as we all know, most philosophers have touched upon multiple different areas of thought, and this historically was more the case back in the past. So for instance, philosophy and science used to be a lot more intertwined, with philosophers like Kant touching on things like anything from morals to aesthetics to metaphysics to a philosophy of science, but he focused a little bit more on physics. And what we want to discuss through this class is what constitutes some of these disciplines and how we can conceptualize them now, what creates a territory and what makes a thing a thing. I wanted to bring up one of the books that I was reading sort of recently when trying to compile all of this together, and it's from Bifo Berardi's book on futurability. He states that what is a form in relation to its content, and how does it happen that a new form can emerge? How do things generate things and concepts generate concepts? And finally, more interesting, how do concepts generate things? And I think these set of questions are pretty interesting and can start setting us on a pace for thinking about things later on within the class. In terms of writing and our thought, as we're mentioning, it became more connected to the idea of sight and seeing, which can be looked at in terms of how we organize sensory input around us, or how we take it in and how we sort through it, and the ways in which we use language to communicate that both inside our heads, so internally to ourselves, which shapes our inner voice, and then how we can use these words to explain how we're feeling and what we're seeing to others. In a way then touching on, as I said earlier, a few philosophers, including Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger, we are touching on ideas of seeing perception. In terms of Hegel, for instance, we're looking at how beings both recognize and then where they fail to recognize one another. And how this tends to be organized is typically in terms of binaries. And within these binaries, there tends to be a relationship in which one term is privileged over the other. As we kept going through and trying to write new things, we also started to come more on the idea of the Black subject, and wrapping back around to what we were trying to do originally in terms of putting ourselves in, not in conversation with, but like antagonistically in relation to right-wing arguments, and particularly Nick Land, we started thinking about the Black subject as a particular subject of history as a way of directly sort of answering that. So from the companion, there is a definition that's called supremacismo meltdown. And it says that it's the supremacy of the half-blood and synthesis of Kudro, Ishan, and Nick Land, the cultural and demographic singularity of the diasporic other catalyzed by European colonization. Its cultural cross-mixing among the other creates an alien plateau or permanent culture of avant-garde experimentation. Around this time, we would get asked a lot about why we were using Afro-pessimism in particular. And as I said, it's sort of putting ourselves in direct relation to and opposite to some things that Land has said. So, for instance, Land has said that he believes capital is the agent of history, and we obviously disagree. For us, Blackness is the true subject of history. Just as the world is an aesthetic, conceptual framing of the earth relative to the human, so is the relationship of the human and Homo sapiens. The human as an idea is also a framing, and it's an aesthetic byproduct of communication amongst people, which finds itself across the dimension of time. The obligations and restrictions of social conduit in a community is usually inscribed through the body, and it's this conditioning, which becomes morality, that is not just, we don't just talk about it, but we sort of perform the actions that are influenced by the ways in which we think. Rituals are invisible social machines, and that regulates the body with serialized patterns. And if we think about all of this, and then we talk about something like hegemony, this is maintained through something like an algorithmic sequencing that is characterized by high order consciousness of a conglomerated body. So in other words, we think of the concept of, and I'm going to delve into this a little bit later, the world, as what makes up the world as juxtaposed against an unclean or savage inhabitant of the earth. What we think of as a concept of the human is made into the image of the divine, and the human has dominion over the earth. The subject has dominion over the objects of its environment. What makes up then civil society and the human in the world occupies a privileged position in relation to it becomes something that needs to be tamed with or dealt with in terms of antagonistic violence. So as I was saying, in terms of these binaries, there's usually one term that is privileged over the other, and we were going to talk more about how that relation plays itself out within society. So for a second, I think I'd like everybody to introduce themselves for a short minute, just because I need to get my charger. And then after that, we can delve back into the second part of the lecture. So if everybody could just go around and say quickly their names, and just a quick introduction as to who you are. It doesn't have to be anything too long. Maybe why you took the course. so we can start. I don't know everybody's names yet, but
let's start with Lenke.
Okay.
Okay. Hi. So I did masters on Dallas and Adorno, and now I'm writing PhD proposal. And this seems to be a good case study for the Anne-François seminar on. We are talking about need of interdisciplinarity and how to do that. So this could be interesting in that regard. And and I'm interested in that Foucault biopolitics bit as well. I wrote some short article a long time ago, and I would like to go back to it. So that's it.
So, Mari, you have to unmute yourself.
I know, 1 second, I know. Hi, I just wanted to ask first if this lecture is going to be published open source, because I not necessarily want to reveal to the entire world what I'm doing in class and what my future objectives are.
I can find a way to get this to everybody. Yeah.
No, I don't want it to have, that's what I'm saying. I want to know if this is a class presentation or if it's going to be broadcast to the entire world, because it would depend on what I'm saying, actually. But maybe I just keep it short in case it is a public.
Oh, sure. I'm not super sure. Maybe Patrick can answer.
No, our first sessions are always public.
Right. So I'm Mari Bestuszewski, and I'm an artist and a researcher and a writer, and I'm currently based in Switzerland.
Okay.
Maybe I jump back to Joseph. Can you activate your audio? Up there, there is something that's called unmute microphone. And if you go up there, you should be able to click this little microphone button. Like to the absolute left, there it's called hide participants, then invite people, and then unmute microphone. Should be around here. Up there. Okay. So maybe you just write it down. I'll ask other people, and then I come back to what you have written there, and I reiterate to the class so we have a little bit of info about you. And I just jump to Samuel now.
Hey, I'm Sam Jackson. I'm like an artist, researcher, and writer, and based in Melbourne. I'm part of a collective, arts collective called Red's Time Incubator, which I guess kind of like attempts to like format the world as like a space of like green capitalism, and then like red algae comes and like kind of like unworlds everything. So yeah, like that's kind of why I'm like interested in this thing and why I'm here. Cool. It's also 5 a.m. where I am, so it's like real early. All right.
So I'll ask Timothy.
Hello, my name is Timothy Trechiokis. I primarily have a background in applied maths, but became very interested in kind of the relationship between machine learning as a discipline in computer science and philosophy of mind. I just kind of want to, pretty much just explore that relationship. I think, primarily from the course, I think a transdisciplinary approach seems to be quite effective in because at least in machine learning, it seems it's influenced by statistics and psychology quite a lot as well. So I but anything.
So well, that was the introduction.
Okay, and we'll just get Joseph's intro later. That's fine. Before I keep going, are there any questions about some of the stuff that I've said already? It's just laying some things out. Sure. We'll just take your mic off, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, hi. I just have one question. I see that the first reading is Tucker, and I would like to ask what proportion of the overall lectures will involve Tucker or Galloway text?
Oh, sorry, what was the last part? What
proportion of the overall lectures will involve Tucker or Galloway text?
Oh, tackling the text. So
No,
this.
No. I will type it.
Okay,
sorry.
Mm-hmm. Well, does everyone have access to the syllabus?
Oh, good question. Maybe that actually maybe answers my question.
Yeah, because you want to know with well, Thacker is only appearing this one time for this one class because it was sort of thrown in to give a little bit more meat to the first class, given that we had to keep shuffling it around. And the rest of it, if you look at the syllabus, is sort of going into things that might not even be necessarily related to philosophy, or they might not be strictly philosophical texts. For one of the courses, for instance, you're going to have to play around with the DNA website and get off into pairs, and we're going to learn actually about bio. Are there any more questions before I go back? Okay. So, as I was bringing up, one of the things I was bringing up is this idea of the world. And it's a concept that we developed in which humans have conceptualized themselves in relation to nature, which usually forms in a hierarchical manner. In other words, it's the overarching way that is often anthropocentric, a framing that other thinkers have put forth and how their presuppositions take on the structure of their own when introduced into society. So for instance, Hobbes and Locke and other thinkers started with the idea of man and nature in order to situate their frameworks, and both sometimes having fixed and polar opposite ideas of the natural world, with Hobbes proposing that nature was something that should be avoided, and Locke claiming that the state of nature was preferable to absolute rule. This caveat, or this reason, is for thinking about how these thinkers have framed it, is why we sort of paint the world in such a negative light. We want to say that we want to put that out there because it's often that we are asked why things are framed sometimes negatively. To us, the world is a hostile place, and it's an environment that is fundamentally irreconcilable with the idea of Blackness. So going back to consciousness and thinking about it as an emergent property of matter, then what forms out of it is culture, and that comes from intelligent agents communicating and moving across physical space. The collective swarm of intelligence of social bodies speaks to the interplay of virtual and the actual through their ability to communicate. So culture, whether one is referring to a biomass or a semiotic mass, isn't immune to greater processes. Hegel demonstrated that what Kant overlooked, which is that although concepts do mediate our understanding of reality, the way that concepts come into being implies insecurity or uncertainty. Whereas Kant focused on the ways in which individual minds control thought, Hegel emphasized the role of collective social learning as a stochastic dialectical process, with reason realizing its own being. The idea of dialectics then explores the process of prescribed change and complexity over time. The ways in which contradiction and its resolution through synthesis promotes novelty and difference in terms of a nonlinear, continuous dialogue between multiple actors within a system. What we can call a culture then, or cultures, becomes an amalgamation of relational differences. So we think about that in terms of, say, like geographic, ethnic, religious, and these are in dialogue with one another and exchanging high-frequency data. These are done in terms of a variety of representative signs that denote objects in space and mediate understanding about reality, material goods, and value forms, which each carry some trace of pre-existing knowledge. The labor of a substrate to crystallize into a higher order form has a protocol with its own function, which is imperceptible to its composition. Little nodes are forced to orbit larger bodies and indefinitely centralize the intelligence of these flows into layers of top-down command and control hierarchies. So again, bringing into the idea of hierarchy, if I was talking earlier about how different thinkers have conceptualized this idea, it tends to be not just anthropomorphized, but hierarchical and linear. I've also brought into the idea that there tends to be a power relation between the two, and that these tend to be set up in terms of relations or binaries. Consciousness alters flows, and consciousness is also subsequently altered by the flow of social composition. And thus we're going to have to talk a bit about desire and affect in this class, both how desires on the micro level form, and then also how those micro level desires form macro scale structures. I'll touch on history, which flows into our conception of history and leads into our conceptions of time. Again, we're going to do that from both a scientific perspective, so for instance, thinking about cognitive limitations, political perspective, how different groups think and what they think is part of their narratives when they speak of the past, and sort of a political or philosophical perception of it, where past and present as concepts are thought of in general, and what do these conceptions of those concepts mean for us. To think about language again, I want to talk about how linguistics is an important aspect of the way in which the world is formed. And through linguistics, actions, representations via aesthetics, and the clean, civilized human is juxtaposed against the dirty, savage primate, which shows itself to us politically and historically if we take into consideration how when we look into the past, these subjects are represented and spoken of. Language homogenizes social bodies into a formal cohesive mass, which means that societies are broad neural networks of interconnected units. And then we can think of hegemony as a nucleus that binds together these cultures of bodies through a shared frame of reference. In this way, something like social cohesion becomes the force by which that organizes the molecular and intelligent subject. And we can think of states as mapping and spanning terrestrial space, which terraforms the Earth. This is what we sort of call the socio-political extension of the world. The idea of what we bring up as the world is touched on both by Frank Wilderson in his work, and it also ties into Heidegger's idea of world disclosure, which again, we're going to bring up later on in other sessions. But this brings me back around to talking about the progression of our overall thought. So ultimately, by revealing that we needed to have a really comprehensive overall of some knowledge and probably a reorganization of pre-existing ideas that are important, we ended up landing on Afro-pessimism. And that is in part because we had to talk about and substantiate why we were centering everything around the idea of Blackness, the idea of the Black subject. So another thing that is central to understanding what we're going to delve into in this class is the idea of apocalypse. And we mean that in two senses. One, in that it is the ending of something in the classical sense. And we also want to explore the lesser known aspect of apocalypse, which deals with the idea of revealing or uncovering knowledge. And we're all probably sort of familiar, at least, with the depictions that are shown of the Book of Revelations and the idea that this is a biblical apocalypse or a final test. What we say and what that means when we want to talk about destroying or taking apart the world is somewhat related to some of these ideas, and that we're not just talking about taking something apart and breaking it up and devolving it and getting rid of it, but that we're also talking about how this is really an uncovering of forms of knowledge. Okay, so I now wanted to shift gears and talk about the reading and the video. Before I ask any questions about it, what did everybody think about those things? Just any broad points? You can just take your mic off. You don't. Yeah.
Before I started with Lenka, then I will start with Timothy now.
You what? I'm sorry.
I started with Lenka before. Now I'm going to start with Timothy. So, Timothy?
I have been fairly busy recently, so I actually haven't got around to looking at the stuff in the syllabus. I wasn't too sure what's like happening with that, so I don't actually have comments. I'm very sorry. So yeah, it might be worth skipping me for that. But
okay, then I jump to Samuel.
Hey, yeah, like I read the Thacker article, which I've read a bit of Thacker before, and I like him. Like I did read it on the plane. Like I've actually, yeah, just like flown from Perth tonight, so like I didn't really take any notes. Yeah, I'm not too sure if I have like a succinct opinion about it right now. Yeah, no, I'm not too sure. And I started the the video for like the kind of like the video, but that was just before I got onto here. But yeah, it seems like interesting. I'm kind of interested in this kind of like antagonism that you're like staging with like alt-right or like NRXs, you know, like and I'd be like keen to see how that goes. But yeah, like I don't know, maybe someone else would be better to talk right now.
Murray.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I read Thacker before quite extensively, and unfortunately I think it's not a good idea for me to comment on the first lecture because I have absolutely no good things to say about this. I find it incredibly pretentious, regardless of how popular his work currently is, and regardless of his reputation at New School. I can expand this in depth, but I don't want to hijack the first lecture, and I don't want to throw you off your teaching tracks by doing this because it's not it's not the subject of the lecture, and it's not the class, but this particular author and this line of presenting work and wording it, I find it to be actually quite tasteless. And I can go into depth on this, but let's hold up and get to know each other. In terms of video, I guess it's one of those fascinating packets on the internet that exist and have existed, and we can talk a little bit about what mechanism or what logic allowed for these things to emerge and become communities of sort. But I think it's also very important to remember that it is still a packet. There are, it's not as over over-encompassing of the representation of the world. It's a very particular niche, and I find that it becomes much more clear once you get out of United States, where in US it feels like the troll bots and this form of communication really overwhelms the world. But there is a possibility to step back from this and see that there are different forms of engagement with the machine, with the internet, and with different communities. And also, I find this to be an extreme almost example of classic left and classic right, wherein my very personal experience of political philosophy is that many of the left elements now, because we live perhaps in the internet age, carry and have a lot of the right identities, wherein sometimes you walk into a very conservative university and you have this, again, a pocket where absolutely radical things happen because the university has already been doomed to be conservative, and then they don't need to prove anything. And so there is nuance to that, but I find it really fascinating in terms of like, well, it's a very clean breakdown of groups and fractions. I hope this is coherent. And I'm sorry I could not have better news.
It was fine.
Thanks.
So we're coming back to you. You are muted.
All right. Well, one of them cannot use his mic. Right?
No, I skipped over.
But now it's fine, is it?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, so I read the paper and I didn't have enough time to develop any critical point on it, that I didn't read anything from Tucker before. And yeah, so I just managed to square it all together, and that's all. And the video, I didn't understand why they didn't talk more about what seemed to be the main, like, crucial problem, this bigotry of low expectation thing. Yeah, which was, I think, underlying all the conversation. Yes.
Okay. So before shifting gears to asking questions and having more of an open discussion about the reading and the video, I did want to make a few maybe points in relation to what some of the things that Mari brought up. I did say your name correctly, right, Mari? Okay, good. So for one, that video that we gave, that's actually, although I guess you see it as something extreme, those are supposedly people who in the US would be considered a little bit more moderate, which is maybe a little bit scary. In that type of discussion, at least here it is super, super prevalent for people to have certain views that are brought up into those videos. Can we mute the mic on the end? I'm sorry, can you mute your mic? Okay.
I muted it.
Oh, awesome. So yeah, these ideas are sort of very prevalent within our culture, at least. And what I guess I'm trying to bring up by bringing something like that debate into play is obviously a little bit more of an archetypal example of some of the ideas that can be floating around. I guess I would maybe push back on that a little bit and say that I think that these ideas are super prevalent, or at least pieces of them. Maybe outside of the US, it might not present itself in the same format, but I would, right, sure, but I would also explain that although the language of it outside of the US seems to be different, I would say that there is a trace of some of these US issues also anyway, even though there are countries that might, say like France or whatever, see themselves as a multicultural whole and everybody in that is going to call themselves French or whatever, it does still exists that there are borders and issues surrounding immigration where everybody is coming in and coming from brown countries. With that said, I also, one of the reasons why we also talked about it in terms of something broader when we were talking about the right was because at the time there was what seemed to be happening, a globalized connection, or the possibility at least for one, which obviously seems to be sort of bubbling up anyway, in terms of sort of the same outputs of right-wing extremism. Although Le Pen didn't get elected, they were trying to use their meme magic that seemed to work here, supposedly, and supposedly helped get Trump elected over there, and also Brexit and all these other things that were happening that was essentially being, that was beginning to brew within the same sort of communities on particularly image boards and 4chan. Oh, that the fractures were extreme. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood that. But I guess that's just something that I want to add anyway. Yeah, you can definitely say something, sorry.
Sorry, can I respond? That's not what I meant at all. And I was only speaking in terms of possibilities and in terms of broader internet. I've lived sufficiently in US and in Europe, so I'm quite aware of the political climate. I'm not saying that there is no right wing. I'm saying that the fractures and the way they're presented, that's in particular becomes very, very occupying in terms of where the discussion is in US. And I think there is a possibility for different narratives. I'm absolutely not denying that there is, I think all of these issues are incredibly global. I don't think any of them are nation state based specific. And I only meant that this particular example occupies a lot of thought and conversation in US.
Oh yeah, sure.
And there are other conversations about this. I'm not saying that the issue itself does not exist. I'm quite aware that we're incredibly fascist worldwide.
Oh sure. So that, yeah, that's all I was saying, was that this particular streamer does reside in the US, and I guess they talk particularly about US issues, although sometimes there are times when he talks to people that reside outside of it. But I mean, he does sort of tend to get into some of the same discussions, even with streamers that are around, I guess, in other areas on terms of particularly immigration and other things. So with that said, I actually would be semi-interested in hearing what you had to say about the Thacker piece, but we can maybe get into that in a second as you're like, no, don't do that.
No, we can absolutely get into that, but I think we can get into it for a couple of hours, and I don't feel like we need to rail the entire lecture into going into this, because it is going to take a long time to unpack those things. But I would love to do it with you with pleasure, and then we can have some more condensed version of that for the entire class. I don't want to hijack the class as well.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, let me know, come up a little bit, because I'm going to ask what you guys sort of thought about it. But in order to segue at least abstractly into the Thacker piece, I wanted to ask everybody, and that sort of gets us into some of the discussions about biology that we're going to bring up later on. I'm going to ask y'all, what do you think is life? Just to give me sort of a definition of what you think life is, and you can take that from any sort of discipline that you'd like, although we're going to focus a little bit on, yeah, the biological definition of it. You can say anything, it's not like a pop quiz. Well, Patrick, you can select who starts first.
Then I jump back to the Institute for Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. Wait, you have to unmute yourself.
Again.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that in the last future and in this Bergsonian vitalistic life is very much about life is elsewhere, constant change and growth and production, and yeah, that's it. It's just a quick idea.
Okay. Then, Joseph, do you want to write something maybe in the group chat, and so I can present your ideas or your questions to the class? I will jump to Mari. Do you want to say something?
No, I've made my contribution.
Okay.
Pulled out sufficient amount of time.
Good. Samuel.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Life for this, I'd maybe think of some kind of like vitalist kind of argument. So just like I'd maybe want to like think more about the kind of like microbial like beginnings of life and the kind of different kind of life cycles and like temporalities that kind of like encounter.
Timothy.
So yeah, I think for life, I'd take like maybe a bit of a pan-physicist sort of like view on it, but I think then life is like categorized maybe by certain like modes and behavior that I think bear resemblance to maybe like, you know, Hegelian like self-consciousness that might include things just ability to self-propagate, self-recognize, and like reproduce. And yeah, I also do think though that like it is something like it's just been said, is something like it is a very big don't know, because I think there's quite a big relation between like politics almost being like a kind of metaphysics of life, and we're kind of, you know, by making politics, we're kind of crossing over maybe like separate definitions and trying to create something contingent of what to call life. So maybe it is something that like, you know, it's quite difficult to define that, like you know, bios and zoe and Agamben, whatever, being like kind of specific life and like common life, and trying to like blend them can have like totalitarian like effects. And but yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I think it's kind of like a don't know, but like it kind of, I would like to relate it to like self-consciousness and self-movement and self-reproduction, but I think putting them in one of those specifically is like maybe quite, you know, dangerous. Yeah.
Sure. So all of these all of these definitions, even saying that I don't know what life is bringing up a broader point that I'm trying to bring up, which is that typically within biology, we think of life as a characteristic that something possesses. And it's that characteristic to have, or the ability to have, certain life-like processes that distinguishes it from certain entities from those that don't have them. And I wanted to start the discussion here in part because we can see already, going back to thinking about multiple disciplines and how they relate to one another, that even within something that we term a hard science, which is kind of a weird distinction to make anyway, we're already bringing up fundamentally philosophical principles and ideas, things that require a lot of deeper thought. And that's just like in opening up what the discipline in of itself is even about. When we think about what life is, in terms of actually a biological definition, there are a certain number of principles that are thought to exist. So one is that it is the being, or whatever it is that we're talking about, has life if it maintains homeostasis. It's composed of cells, or like, it can be one giant cell. It's something that has a life cycle. It somehow undergoes metabolism. It responds to stimuli or its own environment, the environment that it's within. It is able to reproduce, and it can also undergo evolution, in this case, particularly Darwinian evolution. So with that said, I guess I would pose another question maybe some of y'all know the answer already, are viruses alive? And we can start with Timothy and then go the other way.
This one I think is very hard to like answer. I think because it comes into like if you maintain maybe the like I think that viruses are alive. I think they do have the ability to kind of maybe recognize stimuli in a very like abstract sense and have the ability to like, you know, I don't know, affect things in like certain way, but like to some extent I would say, you know, I think it's difficult to define whether like maybe just proteins and stuff like that are alive just because of their ability to like do things and move about like information. So yeah, I would say I think viruses like are alive. I don't think there's, you know, I don't think I wouldn't categorize then like I wouldn't categorize like bacteria as being alive and viruses not, or like, you know, something like that. So yeah, I think so. But I'm this is something like I'd love to expand my knowledge of biology and be able to give like a more reasoned argument for that, and with hope to like actually be able to talk them like, you know, more and stuff. Yeah, that's pretty much it from me.
Samuel.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think they're alive, but like I'm not 100% on like they're like kind of like biological kind of processes and things like that. So yeah, I guess I assume that they're alive, but I assume also that they're kind of like going to like slip outside of the category that you just kind of like identified as well. So yeah.
Mari.
I think viruses is an organic form or bioform or electronic form, which also diverge from organic, containing electrons, right, are alive. But I think since viruses don't particularly care, I would assume whether they're alive or not, then I can't really transplant my anthropocentric subjectivity on a virus and declare them alive or dead, as I don't know how to represent the virus or what it thinks. And does it matter if they're alive if they don't themselves care to be alive? So, but as far like human understanding goes, I would say, I guess they are, yes.
So Joseph wrote something on the side chat, and I'm going to reiterate that. An ongoing process that is entirely understood only in terms that we have created. Human life. All forms of life would be potential ongoing process of energy and interaction, intentional and non. I feel like this is only one way to describe it. I am still trying to figure it out. So I'm now going to jump to the international
yeah, I think they are bursting with life. I think I don't connect in my mind life with self-consciousness at all, and yeah, so I think they are maybe more alive than I am. They have, yeah, functionally they are perfectly alive. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, right, great. So in terms of the biological definition, as it stands now, most don't think of viruses as living, although there is some debate in terms of some of the things that you are all bringing up. So to think about viruses as structures, if we're sort of fundamentally aware of what they are, the reason why they are typically kept outside of the category of life is because, like I said, there are certain principles. So being composed of cells would be something that a virus does not do. Having a life cycle, well, you could sort of maybe debate it, but you wouldn't call it a life cycle. It just has a cycle of replication. And undergoing metabolism and all these other things, it doesn't necessarily do on its own. And in fact, it always needs a host to exist and proliferate more of itself. And that's what makes them sort of interesting, in that they are like true hijackers of all of these systems. And they're some of the oldest things that are around, along with like bacteria and things like that, that are responsible for a lot of insertions within our DNA as a species. Why I bring them up and why I find that very interesting is because, as we just sort of illuminated, we're both learning the concept itself and what that means from this biological perspective, but also wrapping it back around to how this concept is thought of. And sometimes we will ask ourselves, after we know what the content of these things mean within the concept, can we then go back and sort of challenge the concept in and of itself? So like I said, there are these sort of points that we use to distinguish what it is, what something is that has life versus what is something that doesn't. But is that, you know, meaningful? As Mari sort of brings up, if that thing in and of itself doesn't have a conception of whether or not, or care about whether or not it is living or not, then what does that mean, or what is the importance of it? I guess I would argue that, or I would say maybe a couple things. That for one, it is, you guys are also highlighting a bit of anthropocentrism here, and also a notion that centers around, I guess, vitalism or life in and of itself. But maybe I would propose that even if that thing in and of itself doesn't have that conception that wraps back around to it, we as people sort of do, and whether or not we sort of assume it or we reject it, how we have conversations then with other people will form larger social structures. And yes. So one of the reasons why I brought that, oh, don't we all need some sort of host to exist? Can you expand more on that? Sorry, I'm just like putting you on the spot. No, you're like, nah, okay, that's fine.
Like, I totally could, but like, we're gonna get into that. I feel as well in the tangent. We're all quite interconnected. I don't think anyone exists hostlessly.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Well, sort of everyone's illuminating, and you're illuminating too, maybe that these definitions that we have can be a little bit more malleable, that it's not very easy to concisely say like what all of these things mean. But I'm also sort of bringing it up to say like, well, this is what the premise or the fundamental idea upon which an entire discipline is sort of resting. If we think about, you know, back to like grade school or whatever, when you learn about biology, I think everybody sort of heard or wrote down the definition that biology is the study of life. And so in and of itself, we're sort of trying to unpack this. In terms of thinking about like us in relation to a host and all of this stuff, I guess it's just a difference in terms of terminology and what it is. Like if I'm talking about us as biological beings, we'll talk about environment or whatever. We'll talk about ourselves in environments in relation to other things. And the environment for a cell is a body, obviously, or it could be a petri dish or whatever. And that this language sort of changes, which is also why I wanted to bring up psychology, that when we get to environment in terms of psychology, it means something different. It means it in the way that we think about it as, I don't want to say imperfect, but like subjective beings, right? So in psychology, they'll do a lot of studies about with twins or with other people, and will say that this is an environment genetic interaction. Well, what they mean by environment is just like, you know, everything that you interact with as a social being. Whereas, again, like as I'm talking about in terms of biology, a cell is in a particular environment or gets different things from different parts of the environment. So to say that again, or to be a little bit more specific, when we start to form as like literal beings, we start out as a certain number of cells, just like 5 or 6, and those divide exponentially. And you can ask yourself then, how do we get to a fully formed being? Like, how do I have, you know, fingers and ears and lips and all these things? And it's because that one cell is thought of as starting as something that is undifferentiated. And that's why we put a lot of emphasis on, say, stem cells, or why we think about them, because they become, they have the potential to be what we call sort of pluripotent, which is the potential to become whatever kind of cell throughout the body later on. So as we divide, and again, we're going to get into like this later, when we have about 5 cells and stuff, the environment within the womb is different. And since we're getting in different environmental signals to different cells, that forms the differentiation. And I just bring that up to sort of bring about how this different language is used in different disciplines and what that sort of means. Because sometimes when we talk about psychology, it becomes even more ambiguous. Although I guess we were saying even that the division between, I say, like what we think of as sort of hard science and isn't, can be just as ambiguous sometimes. It gets even more so because we're talking about multiple different levels of interaction that are happening and multiple different levels of interplay that are happening within something that is as dynamic and confusing as understanding the cells within the brain. Obviously, if we're talking about biology, we're talking about sort of like we start out by thinking about like an abstracted cell, like just sort of a clean cell, if that makes sense. But then when we get to the differentiation, particularly things like the brain or whatever, are so like complex to understand that thinking about it in terms of how we think about it in psychology becomes sort of difficult. And this, what is thought of as an environment and what we pack and we just say in a paper will be like, oh, there's a genetic environment interaction there. Well, we've just said a lot of things that probably should be thought of and unpacked. So with that said, does anyone have any other connections to, I guess, the Thacker piece? The reason why I sort of brought it up was because I selected that one because I thought it gave, I wanted something that gave like a bit of an overview of some issues or ways of thinking that we can plug into the idea of biopolitics. And I thought that he did, although maybe some like might disagree, a decent job at explaining both like how Foucault thinks about it and like Agamben thinks about it and how these all overlap and relate and differ from one another, essentially. And that becomes interesting in, I guess, shifting gears to the political sense, because as we just like had this discussion about life in like the biological sense, we can also think about it in terms of like a political sense. So if I were to ask everyone here, like if we were to change that and go, well, what do you think about vitality or life or whatever in terms of a political sense? You would think that everybody would say, well, everybody obviously has, you know, a right to life or life and things like that. That becomes a bit of a given or something. But I guess what we are trying to put forth, and maybe other thinkers have as well, is that although liberalism has ushered in this idea of a right to life, taking it sort of from, instead of having the sovereign dole that out to you, that people are indelibly given this life, that we sort of have occluded people when we made that definition. So by that I mean, obviously with the advent of liberalism, and this also ties back into what I was sort of talking about with philosophy and where we were at, that also some of these philosophers come out or are in relation to or predate, I guess, this idea of Enlightenment thinking. And Enlightenment thinking, as we probably all know, has some sort of influence on what shaped liberalism. Liberalism, I guess I'm arguing here, is centered around the idea of life. Again, taking it from the sovereign and giving it to the individual, but it also means that there was somewhat of an anthropocentric framing of it, and that we give this to humans, that the divine right of the sovereign becomes the divine right of the human, essentially, because we are given it through God. So one, to uplift in human rights. So for one, obviously, we didn't necessarily get rid of the idea of God in this very like specific Christian framing, even though we now have like kind of a secular state. And also that there was in packing these concepts together, we also sort of packed in it the idea of what human is. So we don't just say that humans have it, but I guess I'm arguing that some of the issues that maybe we have today and why we are and how we are where we are is because we said humans have rights, humans have life, but both of those concepts were including other subjects when we said it. Obviously, historically thinking about it, when we think about what the human is and what that subject becomes, it doesn't tend to include a lot of other subjects. And that this manifests itself, although it's maybe like a bit of a chicken or an egg scenario, in terms of like, if we have the concept first and then people acted, or if people acted and then we have the concept, you can point to many, many examples within history in terms of like how these prize individuals, these prize humans are treated versus how these other subjects are treated. It is almost as if they are not granted access to this concept linguistically of human. And we know that there is different language to mostly disparaging to explain all types of other subjects that is seen in representation. Again, circling back around to the idea that things tend to function in terms of like binaries and a privileged subject or not, where like things are not quite said, but the inference is that one is privileged over the other. And we can see that then like in literal forms of treatment. So another reason why I picked this reading in particular is because I sort of liked where it tried to map or bring in different historical things that were happening at the time. This is also a little bit of a dated piece. So I believe at the time that issue of Culture Machine was touching on things surrounding the Human Genome Project, because it's written sort of like earliest 2000s. And Thacker here is talking particularly about Bush era politics and in relation to things like biochemical warfare coming up and starting to show itself. And I think that also brings up a lot of things that we can maybe open up for discussion in terms of what, obviously we have to say like, obviously what it means to even be a terrorist and who we're calling these antagonistic people, but that the mechanism by which they started to attack or wanted to attack was biochemical and what that sort of means. This has happened, I think, also domestically because a long time ago we didn't used to have like foil and those like tops on top of like drinks or pills like that. And I think we started doing that because somebody tried to poison people and put things inside of those pills. So we have to think about then how we have structures, how these larger structures are mechanized, and how they reorient and retool themselves in relation to a threat. And maybe we can ask ourselves also why we are so focused on threats. Maybe in part, or I guess I would argue too, that we have to be focused on the ideas of these threats in order to defend the positions that we currently sort of have. That by framing it in terms of like a relation between like us and them or these threats out there, we don't necessarily have to question ourselves, and that by defending against the threat, you sort of solidify and have to like put forth once again the idea that your existence is what it is and that it's packed with all these concepts that you say it is. So with that, yeah, I'd like to open it up. Okay.
Yeah, but isn't the politics of paranoia always embedded in a militant logic? And can we focus on the way of being around this threat by relying on subjectivity without militarizing our own? Because I think there is a difference between responding to all of these instances of giving and denying life, and responding to the sovereign, and trying to sustain life forms and get rid of the hierarchy. And there is also a competition for a right to who gets to impose violence and who gets to be the sovereign. And I think a lot of this competition comes from the mimicking or assuming state mentality in, and part of state mentality to me is taking up a paranoid logic. So I'm not saying that these threats don't exist, but can we address them? Can we liberate ourselves from fear and paranoia?
Well, in a sense, that's sort of what I'm trying to say. I don't want to say that like I'm saying these things as shoulds or whatever. I was just trying to explain how these things appear to us in the world and why it seems set up the way that it is. I obviously, it's sort of the goal to move past some of this thinking, move past these hierarchical structures, as you brought up, and things like that. But that in order to sort of move past it, I guess I'm trying to highlight that there is this reciprocal relationship between it. So it's not just a threat, right? It is, like you're saying, like there's the paranoia that sort of accompanies it. The more that you focus on the threat, the more that like something happens to yourself. And I guess I was trying to highlight that, I want to highlight that, I guess, in terms of things that we were talking about earlier, in terms of like left and right. We could also have a discussion about what that even means and political directionality. Historically, I guess we're arguing that the more that the political right takes on, well, I'm saying that the political right in a sense has to, or invariably does take on more left-wing concepts, that it unintentionally moves the Overton window over, because in terms of and in having to defend its own positions, it has over time had to essentially
make concessions.
Make concessions almost to the left or whatever. That if we were to look at what, and I guess this means different things again, also in terms of space and time. So even if we talk about like, we're talking about when countries are being formed and different explorations were happening, is there even really a political right and left? I mean, we can argue that even though there's like, you know, there's a totalizing system of slavery, there's a totalizing system of all these things. We can say that over time, although it started even optically as a movement or whatever that just has sort of like men, or white men in a certain age bracket, blah, 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 that in order to move through time and to keep defending its existence of this narrative, it's had to become actually like more multicultural. It's had to become more, you know, open in terms of gender. Actually, some of the movement, at least here, although I don't know about other countries, although I think there was some conversation with other countries in terms of the origins of feminism here as a movement, was propagated a lot, both by like some conversation between this country and others. So like we took things from like Simone de Beauvoir and things like that, but a lot of it was also propagated by other women who started to make their own anti-feminist movements. And in order to not appear like the thing that this movement was saying that the right was, they had to let all these women speak and give them platforms and like let them tour around and get paid talking about this stuff. If that sort of, yeah, that makes sense. So any other points from anybody?
Lenka?
We don't have to necessarily call, even if you have something, Patrick. I don't want to put people on the spot all the time.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, if nobody has anything to say, then I
I
think
was maybe going to quickly add maybe about the talking about like maybe the relation between emergency sort of situations like during the Bush era and like 9/11 and how, you know, life is defined. I think bears resemblance when we're talking, you know, back like I don't know how much the faculty piece mentions it, but if it like builds on a Agamben, like the idea of things that are the exception to life kind of defining like what is life. So we have, you know, when it comes to like terrorism, it's like it kind of infects politics. Like, you know, we have to like we're constantly looking at life in an emergency situation, so it's like warping kind of our perspective on it. Like in medicine, maybe how antibiotics are used and treated is now considered like an emergency, that like we've used them too much and things are like evolving too fast. But is that just because of like the emergency, or is that some sort of thing we should have thought about like long before? So I think when looking at, you know, oh, should we look at, you know, when talking about binaries, should we, I think we should be as careful like looking in the positive sense, like what is life, as also like saying, you know, what isn't life as well, because they're quite related to each other, and even related to vegetarianism and veganism, where like a lot of, you know, what people say is, oh, well, certain people, I suppose, in too much of an emergency situation to be able to worry about those sort of things. But is that emergency situation kind of caused in effect by kind of some original misunderstanding of like what life is in like the first place, or like how we should define it? Or should we just, you know, have an approach like that we say like, you know, now we should be like looking at it this way? So yeah, that was pretty much what I wanted to add to it. Like pretty much just about like exceptionalism when it like comes to life being, I think, very important, not just looking for how many things we can define as life, but also whether in doing that we're kind of like, you know, building upon like things we've solidly said like isn't life, like viruses, and whether we had to like kind of revise everything at like the same time.
Okay, sure. Oh, international. Is your mic's off?
Yeah. I just okay. Yeah, that I don't remember how Tucker deals with the like capital point of capital, role of capital in this. That to me it seems that there isn't a binary distinction between life and danger of not life, but more that it's more quantitative. It's a scale between how particular lives are able to produce. That, I mean, for example, hospitals, they don't care about old people that much because they have money. Yeah, so I think it's more important than this binary life-threatening idea on which the necropolitics would be based. Yeah.
Sure. Well, yeah. So that brings up, I guess, a couple different points. And I hope that I'm trying to make myself clear here. What I'm trying to say is not necessarily that there's a binary distinction between what we think of as living and not living, but that like certain subjects are thought of as occupying certain space within sort of binaries, and where they occupy in terms of our minds will sort of define where they fall along in the scale. I think that Timothy brought up Agamben, and Agamben in his state of exception, I believe that he has spoken about or uses an example of Guantanamo Bay as a state of exception. And the reason why that's dictated as such is because within that, the prisoners that are inside of those walls can neither, like, you're stopped from killing yourself. If the people try, you're force-fed. And if you want to have, I guess, a comfortable life, that's obviously not not going to happen either, not within that system. So what I'm trying to bring up is that we have ideas about certain people, that those solidify themselves and make themselves known concretely on the ground in terms of geographical spaces, that those tend to have or be parts of mechanisms of control or mechanisms of discipline. It doesn't necessarily have to be all dictated to control, although I guess it's sort of like related. And that is bringing it into the realm of what I guess we would consider biopolitical. Not that you just have people and we consider them a certain way, but also if we go within those walls, there are categories for and categorical ways of dealing with these people that they probably would have to be like fed or not fed, or it was more like regimen in terms of torture. So you have to be, tonight we're gonna like keep you up or whatever, and we're gonna keep you up all night because it goes against the natural process and need for sleep. That we're going to count probably every day and make sure people are in the cells, and that these regimens are kept, and what forms by them are these ideas, and how that determines how we relate to different subjects. Some things that we've also worked on post, I guess, the manifesto and other things are in relation to what, not just what Agamben's talking about, but taking that and sort of expanding it. So we sort of merged it in a way with what some Afro-pessimists talk about, and I was bringing that somewhat up about the idea of human and that coming out of liberalism. And then we'd have to ask ourselves, if there is not a geographic like location that we say where these, not even othered, I guess just subjects that we don't care about or that need to be tortured or this and that, and even need to be is like obviously loaded language. I'm saying that the state thinks that they need to be, in a sense. If we don't have them in a particular designated location, is it possible that sometimes we can occlude or we can overlook that they are being treated as othered subjects? And so bringing that back to othered subjects that exist within the borders, if we just like have certain ideologies that make you think about, say, free market, capitalism, all these other things, then what certain people will do or think about is in their neighborhood, they might have many different kinds of schools. Some are private, some are public. Although maybe one might be underfunded, and I guess maybe this ties into the idea of capitalism and capital flows. You might have people who would say, well, so what? There is choice here that you could just take your kid and put them into a private institution or something, not sort of thinking about the fact that you have to have X amount of money to do it, that to have X amount of money is not necessarily based on just like hard work ethic and all these other things, that there is actually a serious series of narratives at play that go into what we make form the world and these structures. So in terms of, I guess Timothy brought up antibiotics and resistance. That is an interesting point. What is happening to some of these biological, I don't want to say items, but these biological components as we go through time. What I think is interesting is how some of that is obviously dictated by our actions and our movement through space and time. So what I would also bring up alongside talking about antibiotics and antibiotic resistance is obviously like the anti-vax movement and how that was sort of created based off like pure misinformation, and also through, it got legs through the support of certain celebrities and them going around and saying like, well, I think this is causing autism and all this other stuff. And even though the people or the person that made that paper that was debunked said that is debunked, how that sort of myth still lives on and how that propagates and moves people towards or against certain actions. with things like viruses and things like certain getting vaccinated, it is important that people do it, in part because it is something of a herd immunity. So there are some people that can't really or can't afford to, and again, like coming back to capital and access, get these vaccines or these vaccinations, or just aren't. And so the herd immunity, as we usually call it, sort of does play into whether or not other people get sick, and also can play into more of the possibility that certain organisms might become more resistant down the line. So it's not just that, I mean, there's some possibility always that there will be resistance, that organisms will be resistant over time to certain drugs and things that we're using. But what I like to think of, and what I think is also very interesting, is the ways in which we do aid towards that. In a sense here, it's sort of aiding towards that through our own actions. In terms of things like, when we think globally, some of the issues that are faced in other countries are not necessarily faced by them because we don't have cures for them, but this is a limit. There are limits then of capital and of movement and flow into these countries. And so a lot of these things are passed on through like things like dirty drinking water and things that like could technically be solved because we do actually have the technology to have it. But it's how we think about these different subjects, how we think about these different areas, and how we interact with them because of that I'm sort of highlighting and bringing up. Yeah, sure.
I think when you mention vaccines, obviously it's I've seen that particular situation in the US where certain people will not vaccinate their children. But let's say in an ideal universe, everything is within our reach. Doesn't the question of agency comes up if you just make vaccination mandatory, because it seems to be the smartest thing to do at the moment? It would be another maybe relevant example in this situation where a white woman on television was arguing that certain group of African women were given birth control and they should absolutely take it. And there was an African-American woman, or I think it was actually an African woman from Kenya, who was responding saying, look, we're going to decide by ourselves, stop trying to give us stop trying to enforce biopolitics on us, right? But there were also a number of African women who were like, well, we would really like to have some birth control. And then there is no longer this binary between who is right, but then the question of agency comes up, I think, in this conversation. So there is a form of colonial imposition in the case with birth control, and there is stupidity in the case with vaccines, but there is also like, how much do you impose your agency? And if you do, then you not also become a state. You know, what if we're wrong about vaccines? Just as a hypothetical.
Sure. So to answer that in part, I think that, yeah, I guess you're bringing up also that wrong is sort of like this, you're saying like maybe semi-relative at times. Is that what you're? Well, you mean like, because you're saying like hypothetically, obviously in this situation, if it is, then.
No, I'm saying that it might not be binary necessarily. And in every case, and how can we proceed with the case with vaccine without imposing vaccinations on people who reject them?
Sure. Yeah, that poses, I guess, a bit of a difficulty sometimes. I guess what I would say is that people should be informed more so as to the process by which science makes its decisions, even if they don't particularly understand all the particulars. I think that everybody should be informed as to why people should ideally trust in experts in certain fields, and why we should trust, like, say, certain, it's more than if one study says it, but if there's like consensus and what scientific sort of consensus means. With that said, the idea of agency is something that also is brought up in the actual sciences, because as you're sort of touching upon and bringing up, there is a history of, I guess, imposing things upon people with birth control. As you probably know, like, it was tested first and trialed on people in Puerto Rico. And that's where some of those trials happened first. And those were not, I mean, they didn't have an option that was sort of mandatory. What I will say is, although it becomes super tricky to draw a line between, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking about, Preciado's ideas, and the idea of then like the Oedipal panopticon, is that, yeah, I think people need to be more informed as to what scientific consensus means, because even if later one can be proven wrong, I guess, people are still acting in the interest of what that information presents to them at that moment. And I guess, given, I guess, time and temporality, that's sort of what people can sort of do. Although there is, like, I guess, as you're bringing up, like a really big gray area sometimes with agency and things like that. Here, it is mandatory for children to get vaccinated. However, you can get an exception to that if you have religious or cultural reasons. And the reason why people are not getting vaccinated as much is because actually, like, people are technically abusing that exception. That not everybody who wants that exception actually has those ideas or has like those those views, but they're using it in order to exercise just an ideology of free rights. Just using that as liberalism in and of itself is an ideology. What they're saying then is like, my religious belief, by not having a religious belief and putting down that they have one to sort of get out of the vaccinations. In a sense, what I'm arguing is that they're saying that liberalism, in a sense, is their religious belief. That, in a sense, there's nothing that you can do to, I guess, and I wouldn't have a world where this is technically more forced than it is, but just more awareness and more understanding for people, because there are always going to be people that, like, for instance, actually don't want to do that because of valid religious beliefs and stuff like that. So as long as the pool of those that do get it, and those that have the awareness of why they should get it, it actually does, in a weird way, like, or not in a weird way, it actually does scientifically protect and lower the possibility that those that don't want to do it are still safe.
I guess with respect to agency, there's always there are certain limitations given environmental factors, in a very, I guess, literal sense. Yeah, since no object, no subject is as atomized as it as like liberalism purports it to be. Yeah, there's still that intersubjective limitation with respect to agency. Just, I guess, like broader, like that's the whole point.
Sure. You're saying that don't we again assume a superior position of an informer and reiterate the hierarchies of a sovereign subject? So I guess I would bring up that again, we're sort of like hopping discipline to discipline here. And that's why I think that people need to be more informed in terms of like what it means for scientific consensus to like exist, or what that actually does mean. It's not rare, it's rare sort of, or it doesn't happen all the time that there is consensus and what that actually means. There are lots of studies being done, there are lots of investigations and experiments being done, but what consensus in the scientific sense means is something, I guess, different than we would think about it in terms of like in the popular sense. I think that there is sometimes when there sort of is a more clear-cut answer in the world of science as to what these things are and what the mechanisms are that cause it and all sorts of stuff. Now, what to do about it then comes into the political sense, and that becomes a little bit more murky. I think there is an example that we typically learn of where there was this indigenous population, and this is something that's like way more gray area than, say, I would say like vaccines. So I also want to like highlight that in terms of black and white or gray area, it's also depending on like this topic that I'm talking about. I guess it is so that with something like vaccination, it is weird to even say, presume that it's wrong, because it's been so tested and so replicated that everything happens more so in science in terms of probability. And the probability is always there. And that's why even the language that reflects it says, well, in degree of scientific probability or whatever, which means like maybe something's 99.9% this way, or like we think it is that way. They always leave even like that small percentage for abnormalities and like, you know, the one person or something where something happens and we can't super explain it. But that is different than, say, thinking about some of the other concepts where there's a little bit less of a consensus. So when people use that consensus, like say with climate change or something, that's pretty much what they are saying. And the reason why we can sort of trust into that is in part because of the overlap and the overlapping nature of what scientific subdisciplines do and how they approach knowledge. I guess I can get into that a little bit more. Yeah, but now, oh yeah, going back to that example, this is something that's like, I guess, a little bit more like gray area, is there was an indigenous population where it was their custom, and it is their custom, to eat human brains, to eat like other people's brains. And what they were finding out was that these people were getting some sort of disease that was called Kuru, and it was caused by like these things called prions, which are sort of misaligned or misformed, misshapen proteins. So I guess, and there's absolutely no answer for this that's clear cut, is if you find out the mechanism of action for this disease, if the tribe or whatever says that they're unhappy and like confused as to why people are dying, and you figure it out, if you figure out that it is actually one of these rituals that is maybe contributing to it, what happens then? Maybe, and I could open this up more, in my opinion, I guess the only thing that you can do is sort of make people somewhat aware. But again, like thinking about even like anti-vaxxing or something like that, what is being brought up, or what you're bringing up over here, is that we are not as atomized, I guess, as liberalism would like us to think, that these things sort of, or this type of ideology or these ideas, the people that don't want to get it because, you know, they just don't want to, or they think it is a function of an output of a broader self-organizing system that actually is composed of people acting in their own agency in a weird way.
No, there is no doubt that vaccines are right. I'm not arguing the fact that vaccines are scientifically proven. I'm only saying that don't we in some way accidentally or inadvertently assume a position of very white savior when we start to, through information flow, impose vaccines on others. It's just speculative critical exercises to how certain regime is being imposed around the vaccine. Or let's say, it's not so much for me a question about them as a question about us. Like, where is it within my right to tell someone what to do with a child or with their body? Mm-hmm. How do I do that without, again, perpetuating very authoritarian narratives and ways of engaging with other people?
Yeah, sure. Sure, no, I think I don't think we're like really, I think we're sort of in the same area anyway. What I was saying was more, yeah, it was pretty much that I don't particularly like imposition. However, it is, you know, everybody has to be aware of what happens if not. There is always the option to not, and obviously people can exercise that, but people can exercise that till their death, and that is real. So yeah, and it's like, well, it's so what for those people, but I mean, obviously it's other people that get involved also. And I guess we have to ask if people, actually maybe I would reverse sort of the structure here, even though like, I guess I agree somewhat in that it brings up these questions, but that instead of thinking about it in terms of subjects in the bodies that they tend to inhabit, I would think about it in terms of, ideologies. And I guess I'm saying that the ideology to where like you say because one wants to exercise freedom, which is fundamentally liberal and fundamentally enlightenment, fundamentally white, et cetera, so I will not vaccinate my child, is sort of playing into the, in a weird way, the privileged position in and of itself, that the knowledge that comes from science, although it has unfortunately been put on other bodies and like forced upon them, the knowledge in and of itself, like scientific knowledge and like this wealth of knowledge, is not inherently in and of itself white. Like we're obviously going to keep, yeah, sort of. No, I know you're not saying that. Yeah, of course.
I think it's going to be covered also in psychoanalysis, right? Because then we enter into the you're crazy and you're scientifically proven to be crazy, you know, and then we're doing this for your own protection and like rise up a lot of points, which is what my response is to if someone decides to die, so what? You know, let them die. You have no right over someone else's life.
Oh yeah, sure. And I mean, it's not, again, like also it's not in terms of like, I'm not usually saying it in terms of like, well, what we should or like rights or all this other stuff, but it's that what I find most interesting usually is that when people make these decisions, they don't tend to think that it is going to lead towards death, that they're doing these things in usually the preservation of life. Like obviously, if you have this child or whatever, what you think you're doing is protecting your child, but you're based off of like some things that are sort of misinformed or whatever have you. The only reason why I said misinformed is like in this specific example. But yeah. So any more points? I guess we're almost.
I have one thing to offer for that discussion. I'm remembering the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the 30s and the 70s. Those people definitely would have wanted to get a vaccination, and therefore, at least from American perspective, the colonializer and the rather uses those who he sees beneath him and uses them as test subjects and doesn't impose vaccinations on them. So I just wanted to put that forward because it's part of my research.
Oh, awesome. I actually want to talk to you more about that outside of this, but that sounds interesting. Okay, if there's any more last minute thoughts for this class. Also I did want to talk about next class. So I will be in transit and I'm supposed to do a talk during that week. So unfortunately, throughout my outside of my control, there might be a conflict on that actual day with our class and this talk that I'm doing. The class, and we can talk about this more in emails, can happen earlier if that works for people. But also, I guess somebody here is saying that they're here at like 5 a.m. or whatever. I don't know if that would be better or worse. So we probably need to like do that. But what I wanted to bring up was we're going a little bit out of the order of the syllabus. And I want to have the next class be, and we're going to have like a guest speaker on to look at this syllabus. Well, I don't have it particularly in front of me, but I know that there's one that's supposed to be about like broadly economics, and that we're going to have a guest speaker for that one, and that will be the next session. And then after that, every class will be on according to the order of the syllabus. It's just getting kind of like bumped down one. Technically for this class, you can sort of start anywhere because we're doing each set of classes or each particular class as a module that explores a specific discipline or certain concepts within that discipline in and of itself, and how this maps up to our larger framework. So if everybody's cool with that, we can sort of email about that. Because if that doesn't work and we can't do earlier on that day, we can find a different day during that week, or we can play around with different things. Okay. Any more thoughts? Oh, Timothy, did you come off just?
Yeah, I was going to say in terms of like, sorry, just quickly on terms of timing, I wouldn't like, probably earlier on that day I wouldn't be able to do, but also for like, since the syllabus is changing, is there any reading materials for like the economics one specifically that we should be like looking at and stuff before then? Like, because I think this on the syllabus.
Oh, it's like TBD. Is it to be determined?
Oh, okay. I'm guessing that will go out in email or be posted in or something then for that.
Yeah, it's because I have a guest, so I wanted, I think there might be a reading or two on there, but I wanted the guest to dictate sort of what he wanted for us to read. So I'll just ask today and be able to get that for everybody and have that hopefully out to everyone tomorrow.
Okay. Is there also like a specific place for like discussion, I suppose, for this session? Because I think I'd like to discuss like in kind of more like text form or something, some of the things that have been like in this session. So maybe it'd be like the group chat or like Facebook group or something like that is like a good place to post. Like I think have some memes that like, may be relevant where it's like, post. Yeah. But yeah. Is there one designated place, like is what I'm saying, for like, posting like content maybe from this session that we've like just done, or like, opening up the discussion a bit more, like, and then, yeah.
Well, I think, Patrick, can we do that? Can we set up something where there's a space or like a Facebook group or something, or maybe like even a thread?
I think we have the messenger group, but I can definitely try to get a group together for this whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because I'm not friends technically with everybody here on the internet yet. I think we've only been corresponding through emails, but yeah, that's great. And then people can we can continue these discussions sort of like outside of just this space and time.
Yeah. We have. I don't think we have a group for that, but we can absolutely make one. I can absolutely get one together. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Okay. Any final thoughts or whatever?
But we would have still half an hour left if you.
Oh, we do actually. I thought we were doing just 2, or we do 2.5.
No, we are doing 2.5 hours. Always.
Nice.
Okay. Well, then, is it possible we could take a short break and then reconvene?
Okay, if you want to let that, then let's do the short break and then come back.
Okay.
I can.
Oh. Okay.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
Okay. We can reconvene and do, yeah, we can knock out another 20. So the last sort of points I want to bring up about the Thacker piece, I realized that I did write a whole bunch of quotes here that I think are sort of touching on some of the things that we were touching on. And then I want to ask a question and sort of segue into a little bit of a discussion about the video. So going back to threats and things like that, there is a quote in it that says, US policy has ontologically redefined war along the lines of terrorism. That is, terrorism as precisely a series of non-catastrophic but highly threatening events. In this sense, not only is all terrorism bioterrorism, but we may be witnessing a new definition of life itself in which terror exists virtually in relation to life. So sort of bringing up again, these distinctions in sort of what we make and where a sort of gray area is as well, and how these ideologies tend to reorient, I guess, how we see time or how those people see time. What I thought was interesting about that particular section or sector was that terrorism is being redefined as like the constant threat of threats happening to you in the present here and now. So that these threats from the future sort of come in and have the possibility of folding in on your present. And I think that sort of segues into a bit of a question that I wanted to ask in relation to what was sort of being brought up earlier about this video and the different players in it, in that conversation. What we see as sort of political directionality, or what I guess right and left actually is taken to mean. Because I guess what I'm trying to bring up and argue is that obviously in relation to other countries, you know, there's a bit of a relationship where we, or whatever the country is, tends to be, or some of them tend to be like on this privileged side over others, and what that sort of means globally, but how that can sort of change when we go domestically, and how domestically, although a lot of the countries that we speak about now or think of as having like broadly the Western world are influenced all by sort of Enlightenment thinking, liberalism, etc., how different things play out domestically for those areas. So I guess an actual question that I want to ask is, what do we define as, or what do y'all think of as like right and left, broadly speaking? I'll start not with Timothy, but international. What is your name again so that I can not call you that?
Lenka.
Lenka?
Yeah. Lenka is your name.
Lenka, yes.
Lenka, yes.
So hey, did you?
But I came a bit late. I'm not sure if I know what.
Oh, sure. Okay, so maybe we'll instead start with Timothy again. Sorry about that, putting you on the spot.
Oh, so yeah, so defining left and right, I suppose right is like characterized by being reactionary, and I suppose then you have to open up what reactionary means, which I really do think can be as simple as characterizing a group of people who identify with a politics that is constantly reacting to world events in like a flippant way that is kind of influenced by like I suppose like ritualistic type behavior, where it's easily quite like, it makes it quite, it's sort of set logics and circuits that make it very easy to quickly determine the right course of action when hearing like constantly like complex issues that come out of it. I suppose what the left would be in opposition to that is kind of trying to you know, recognize the kind of spreading and flowering and complex nature of how kind of history unfolds, and not having really quite set methods that we already know and stuff. So assuming that there is some kind of implicit right way to like respond to world events. And I suppose, you know, in terms of talking about terrorism, like it's very easy to have reactionary politics when it comes to terrorism by like, you know, saying, well, we should be looking to absolutely prevent terrorism and have like a war on terrorism and stuff, and not, you know, think of like the kind of implicit problems with kind of, you know, a very binary logic when it comes to like terror and stuff. So yeah, like I would say the right is characterized by having reactionary politics, and I think reactionary can be taken in quite a literal sense. And then the left should be opposed to that and also look what is opposed to being quickly reacting to things. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I don't know if Patrick is around. So Mari?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think I would have a very similar question to the one I had before in response to this. I believe that Baudrillard, I think it was in 2002, wrote a wonderful essay on terrorism, where he said that terrorism always mirrors and mimics a position of the state. So my question here, and I guess from that point, is what position of resistance, or if you want to speak more in Agamben terms, what position of together being is there possible is there possibly a position within which we don't have to rely on the production of enemies at all, or the production of the other, or speak about them, right? And what kind of mode of discourse production that would be. Because in my observation or in my studying, the mode by which we debate, the conversation might be different, but the mode by which we debate these things has become quite uniform between left and right. Or the way we exchange in this. And very often in liberal arguments or in the left arguments, there is not actually a proposition for better together being or for less necropolitics, but an argument for who get to have the rights to impose violence and how to gain access to that right. And how can we expand this beyond the right to violence, whatever the argument might be.
Well, I'll take, wait, are you a little bit more clear as what we're saying now? Linka? And then I'll come back around to that.
Yeah, so just right left with division. I think it's heritage which is used in culture, media wars, and not much more. That what should be done is to create new political landscape, I think, and take as a key term not binary terms, but yeah, like yes, that's it. I don't have much.
No, that's totally fine. You can.
Yes.
So I guess that I would say is that what differs from what we're trying to say from, I guess, a particular liberal position is that in the position and in using the words that we're using, we're simultaneously examining the way that they are formed and also trying to critique them in and of themselves. So for one to say that someone is a terrorist obviously is loaded in and of itself. And I want to talk about the sort of vague nature of how that term is termed to begin with, how that sort of elucidates certain power structures in and of itself. But then the difference is also at the point of seeing. So with liberalism, there is a tendency to see atomized subjects as they appear in and of themselves as concepts that are complete. And what I guess I'm trying to say, if I didn't necessarily bring it up, is sort of in part that in order to maybe correct or to upset or think about processes that can happen outside of those that produce these subjects the way that they produce, that we actually would have to talk about the process in which that they are produced. So different countries and what are thought of as terrorists in other nations is not just, these people don't just appear, obviously, right? They are the result of and live in, even if there's someone that lives in the area that does not or whatever want to do that. And so, well, to back up, that is so that there's two conversations here. So there's one at the level of language that I'm saying that something is, when I say something is a terrorist or whatever, what does that even mean? And isn't it already sort of like elucidating this relationship? And then the second would be thinking about how those subjects are and what we call that are produced in order to appear to us to begin with. So it's not just that these people and these nodes and these things exist in the world, that there is historical and all these other influences in it that make them appear as they appear. So obviously when we talk about other countries and things like that, what is, I should say, like what is determined to be where terrorism comes from, and obviously that again is loaded, is in part, one could argue, the result, even if people exist there that don't necessarily go on to do those actions. There are people just by being born there that have to be in conversation with the narrative and the structure that is these hegemonic forces, and that those are created by a system of historical and economic principles that and ideologies that control the flow of capital and create it so that this fight for dominance even exists. Obviously, I guess what we're trying to say is to think outside of the hierarchical structure in and of itself, but then we need to identify that the structure that produced these people was hierarchical to begin with. And that what that means to deconstruct that, I think, is in part, at least the first is to obviously like reveal that and reveal that to people. No.
So we are only having 12 minutes left until the next seminar. We stop, and I would like now to ask people who can present and respond to the texts next that we have next session.
Okay, I'll have to do it, I guess, through email. I guess some people sort of left the chat a little bit anyway. To make people do it in terms of pairs would be kind of good. I don't know if on their copy of the syllabus, and I sort of want to ask because on my copy of the syllabus, I do have for that week on economics as ritual and vocation, I do have like a few readings. Do people see that also? Or does it just say TBD? Because I might have a different version.
I have a version with different texts.
Okay, so there's a few texts there.
Yeah.
Then I'll get, in addition to that, the ones that the guest wants, but people can sort of start, and we can maybe via email, like start divvying that up, who will pair off and sort of present these pieces. How many do we have? 6? So we can have 2 groups or 3 groups of 2, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so 3 groups of 2. I'll try for whatever the third group is to, as soon as possible, have what it is the guest wants to introduce, and that would make it, I guess, even.
But I just would like to offer one thing. If Mari and Lenka, let's say, if you, because you're already here, if you I think you could basically choose whatever text you want to respond. Because they are here, I mean, I think why not give them preferential treatment? No, because then I definitely get people who come to the next class and have definitely done something. So would you be up to present something next time?
I am confused as to what the curriculum is still, because I'm a little slow, I guess, today. And what I see on the 27 is a symbiotic view of life. We have never been individuals.
Oh, so that is being changed. What I guess I was trying to say is next week we're going to instead have the class that was moved down, class 5. as a second class.
Sorry,
And
I
then
missed that.
the
Yeah. I
third
had too
class.
many things in my head, so I missed that.
No, you're good. So from that section right now, and that also I'm going to add one more reading from the guest himself tomorrow when I get that.
I'd love to discuss John, as I just brought him up. It seems very apropos.
Okay, sure. Is that cool with you, Linka?
Okay, and you will just send it again, the readings.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
that's good.
and I'll have that.
So just to make sure, symbolic exchange and death is what I'm working towards, right?
Yeah, if you'd like to do that one, sure.
This is class 5.
Yes.
I mean, I just want to know what is more comfortable for you and where you want this to go, because I'm happy to take any text.
Oh, yeah, no, you can have a choice of it, because pretty much what we're going to do is I'm going to be more in the same boat as y'all next class, because we have someone who knows more about economics than me. He will be presenting more on his own things that he puts together, and one of the readings will be in direct relation to what he's going to be talking about. So then the second half, or the latter half, will be people doing these presentations of the other readings, or all of the readings, including the ones that he picks. Oh, so this says over there that Mari will present and Lenka will respond. Okay.
And you will email the text, because I lost my syllabus and I couldn't find it again in the Google class. I don't know why.
Okay. Yeah, we'll fix it.
By presentation, what do we want? Do we want a summary of the text, a summary and critique of the text, and how long should it stretch? Critique and a question, some analogies as an example. What's the format?
So if it's 3 people, or 3 people going this time, it should be roughly about, about 10-15 minutes, and then a couple minutes for the response. It can be, you can take it however you'd like. I mean, probably like a bit of a summary first, and then if you have like criticisms of it within it, you can obviously like put that in as you go along. Yeah. So Timothy, is it cool? Would you like the other piece then, or do you want to wait and kind of wild card it and see what the guest wants?
I was kind of going to say I wanted to call dibs on 2 of them. The Capital of Spirits by Karatani and the one on Laplace's Demon, I think. Both look quite interesting to me, and I'd like to, read them. I think, because I'm quite interested in, I suppose, prediction and economics, and I think I could, yeah. But I don't know, are we pairing up, or do you want to pair me with someone else to do it? Because I don't know if I'm guessing Joseph is the other person in the thing, so I don't know if they want a partner, I could go with them and stuff, or
Well, that's what we have to figure out, I guess. You could do the actual presentation, and apparently the other person does the responding to you. So,
okay, that kind of makes sense, because then could even if there's one person designated as the response or something, could even split the time almost more 50-50, because I'd be interesting the response. But yeah, that sounds good then. So is it okay if I say for now Capital of Spirits and the natural resource accounting and evaluation of the world? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, tight. Does that settle away everything, Patrick?
That's superb. Everything's settled then.
Thank y'all. That was awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. It was a great class, and everything that has been written here in the group chat is already in your classroom, so you can reread and ask about things there.
Okay.
Is there going to be the Facebook group created very soon? I've got an itchy trigger thing for posting.
No, I'm just going to create the Facebook group right now.
Okay.
Oh, actually, Mari, you say you have you looked at symbolic exchange and death before? Then
I've looked at most of his work before, and my work is very much connected to that topic.
then I want you to actually do, you're going to do the other one, whatever the X factor piece is. I guess I would like prefer people to have things that like kind of take them a little bit more out of their comfort zone.
I think I haven't read that in a really long time, but I'm happy to do whatever you want.
Okay, sure. But I'll, yeah, so I'll email that about to people. Because again, like next class, I'm also sort of out of my comfort zone. This is not something I typically deal with.
We should all suffer equally. We've reached an equal suffering consensus.
Yeah, an equilibrium of suffering. But all right, sick. So yeah, more details in that. We'll get this group chat going on, I guess, Facebook or somewhere else in the internet. And thank y'all all for a great first class.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Superb.
Bye.
See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.